The dust of the high plains stings Alara's eyes, mixing with the sweat that beads on her brow despite the cool morning air. Her hands, chapped and stained with gentian violet and blood, move with a practiced tenderness over the fevered brow of a young soldier, barely a man, his face pale beneath a sheen of perspiration. He groans, a low, wretched sound that tugs at something deep within her, a familiar ache of empathy. Around them, the makeshift aid tent, patched canvas flapping in the incessant wind, offers little respite from the harsh Wyoming territory. She is an island of weary calm in a sea of suffering, the gentle swell of her belly a silent testament to a life she fights to protect, even as she tends to those whose lives are ebbing away. The war, or what skirmishes and bloody disputes passed for it in these remote parts, has left a trail of broken men, and she, with her dwindling supplies and boundless compassion, is all that stands between many of them and the grave. A shadow falls across the tent opening. Alara doesn't look up immediately, her focus on replacing the damp cloth on the soldier's forehead. Men come and go, some bringing wounded, others seeking aid themselves, a few just curious, their eyes lingering on her pregnant form with varying degrees of pity, suspicion, or something uglier. She's learned to ignore the stares, the whispers. Her purpose here is clear, a penance and a prayer all in one. "Ma'am," the voice is low, rough-edged like weathered stone, but there's no immediate demand in it, no leering undertone. Danger's close and a rescue might be at hand. Before we see if justice or peril finds them, share in the comments. What's your favorite story about someone being saved against the odds? And if you're rooting for them, hit like and subscribe. Alara finally straightens, her back protesting, and turns. The man filling the entrance is tall, broad-shouldered, his silhouette stark against the bright, unforgiving light outside. He wears the dust of long travel like a second skin. His face is hard to read in the shadows, but she sees the lines etched by sun and hardship, and a long, faded scar that cuts a pale path from his left temple, disappearing into his hairline. His eyes, though, are what hold her. A startling clear gray, steady and observant, taking in the scene with an unnerving stillness. He's seen battle, she thinks. It's written in the way he stands, in the quiet intensity of his gaze. He's not one of the local militia, nor one of the regular army patrols that sometimes pass through. He looks like a man who belongs to no one but himself and the unforgiving land. He is, she recognizes with a tremor of unease and a flicker of something else she can't name, a different kind of danger or perhaps a different kind of unknown. And with a single, assessing glance at her, then at the rows of wounded, a silent decision seems to form in those unreadable eyes, a decision that feels as if it could shift the very ground beneath her worn boots. The canvas tent, a relic from some forgotten campaign, billowed and sighed around Alara like a dying lung. Its scent was a grim potpourri of unwashed bodies, stale blood, carbolic acid, and the ever-present dust of the plains. For months, this had been her world, a narrow, desperate space carved out of the wilderness near a temporary cavalry outpost, established to quell scattered uprisings and protect the thin trickle of settlers heading west. Alara had arrived not with the soldiers, nor with the settlers, but as a woman adrift, her past a landscape she rarely allowed her mind to traverse. She was with child, her husband, a gentle scholar named Thomas, lost to a fever on the journey meant to take them to a new life in Oregon. Stranded, her meager funds dwindling, she'd found a grim purpose when the first injured men were brought back from a skirmish. Her mother, a country midwife, had taught her much about herbs and healing, and that knowledge, coupled with a quiet determination, had made her indispensable. The soldiers, a mix of raw recruits and hardened regulars, treated her with a rough respect born of their need. She was the angel, or sometimes, more prosaically, Doc Alara, though she had no formal training. She set bones, cleaned wounds that would make hardened men faint, and sat with the dying, offering what comfort she could. Her pregnancy, now blooming into its 7th month, was a strange counterpoint to the death and suffering she witnessed daily. It was a silent promise of continuance, a small, fierce flicker of hope in the overwhelming darkness. Yet it also made her intensely vulnerable. There were men whose eyes lingered too long, whose offers of help felt more like threats. She kept a small, sharp skinning knife tucked into her belt, more for reassurance than any real belief it could deter a determined man. The man who had appeared at her tent flap called himself Silas. He hadn't offered more, and she hadn't asked. He'd arrived leading a pack mule laden with supplies, bandages, laudanum, even a few precious tins of coffee, which he'd offered not to the surly quartermaster of the dwindling outpost, but directly to her. His explanation was brief. He'd heard there was need. His face, as she'd seen in better light, was indeed a map of past conflicts. The scar near his temple was old, silvered, but others, newer, marked his hands and forearms. He moved with a quiet economy, a stillness that seemed to absorb the chaos around him. His eyes, those unsettlingly clear gray pools, missed nothing. He'd watched her work for a full day, sometimes lending a hand with a quiet, surprising gentleness, lifting a heavy man, fetching water, his presence a solid, unobtrusive bulwark. The outpost was shrinking. With the immediate threat of Indian attacks subsiding in this specific area, the cavalry was being redeployed further west. Soon, the last of the soldiers would leave, and with them, the tenuous protection and meager supplies they represented. The thought filled Alara with a cold dread. Where would she go? What would she do? The nearest town, Redemption, was a good 3 days' ride, and its name, she'd heard, was more an ambition than a reality. It was a rough-and-tumble settlement, not a place for a lone, pregnant woman. One evening, as the sun bled crimson and orange across the vast horizon, Silas found her sitting outside the tent, stitching a torn shirt by the fading light. The air was cooling rapidly, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. Most of the remaining soldiers were in the small, ramshackle lean-to that served as their mess hall, their rough laughter and off-key singing a jarring counterpoint to the prairie's immense silence. "They'll be gone by week's end," Silas stated, not a question. He leaned against a wagon wheel, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the distant, darkening hills. Alara nodded, her needle pausing. "I know." A few townsfolk, mostly hard-bitten opportunists who followed the army's wake like coyotes, had set up a few shacks a mile from the outpost. She'd seen their scornful glances when she'd ventured there for supplies. A woman like her, alone and visibly with child, was an easy target for judgment and worse. One portly woman, the self-proclaimed mayor's wife, had sniffed loudly as Alara passed, muttering, "Shameless, carrying on like that without a man in sight. Ought to be run out." The words had stung, a fresh wound on top of older, deeper hurts. Silas shifted, his gaze returning to her. "It ain't safe for you here, alone." Alara's hands tightened on the worn fabric. I haven't decided what to do." The lie felt thin, even to her own ears. The truth was, she had no plan, only a growing knot of fear. He was quiet for a long moment, the only sounds the chirping of crickets and the distant yip of a coyote. His gruffness, she was beginning to learn, often masked a deeper current. He was a man of few words, but those he spoke usually carried weight. He pushed himself off the wagon wheel, his shadow falling over her as he took a step closer. She felt a familiar prickle of apprehension, the instinct of a lone woman in a harsh world, but it was tempered by something else, a nascent sense of trust she was almost afraid to acknowledge. He'd shown her only quiet respect, a practical kindness that asked nothing in return. His initial attempts at providing safety had been subtle, positioning himself near her tent at night, his bedroll laid out under the stars. A quiet word to a soldier whose comments had bordered on lewd, a word that had made the man flush and back away. "I have a place," he said finally, his voice still low. North of here. Small ranch. It's quiet, he hesitated. A rare sign of uncertainty. Enough room. You could rest there. Until the baby comes. After 2, if you've a mind. Alara stared at him, speechless. The offer was monumental, unexpected. A place of safety, a refuge. But with a stranger? A man whose past was as scarred and unreadable as his face? Yet the alternative was terrifying. The vast, indifferent wilderness, or a town like Redemption, full of grasping hands and judgmental eyes. She looked down at her belly, where a gentle flutter reminded her of the life she carried, the life she had to protect. His quiet attempts at kindness were one thing. This was an offer of sanctuary. It felt like a lifeline thrown into a stormy sea. The awkwardness of the situation hung heavy between them, thicker than the evening cool. He wasn't looking at her, his gaze fixed on some distant point, as if the offer itself had cost him something. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands were clasped loosely before him, not quite at ease. The loneliness she sensed in him was a mirror to her own, a desolate landscape they both inhabited, albeit for different reasons. The gruff exterior was a shield, she suspected, much like her own carefully constructed composure. The journey ahead, both literal and emotional, felt immense, fraught with unspoken questions and uncertain answers. A sudden commotion from the direction of the soldiers' lean-to shattered the fragile quiet. Loud, drunken shouts, the crash of something heavy falling. Alara flinched. Trouble was a constant companion in this place, never far away. Silas straightened, his body instantly alert, his hand instinctively moving towards the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. "Stay here," he murmured, his voice now devoid of its earlier hesitation, replaced by a steely command. He moved towards the noise, not with haste, but with a deliberate predatory grace that spoke of long acquaintance with violence. Alara watched him go, her heart pounding. The catalyst for change, it seemed, was rarely a gentle nudge. More often, it was a shove into the unknown. A group of soldiers, clearly in their cups, had surrounded a younger private, no more than a boy who was protesting weakly. One of them, a burly sergeant named Rourke, known for his mean streak, shoved the boy hard. "Think you're too good to share your whiskey, pup?" Rourke snarled, his face flushed. Before anyone could intervene further, Silas was there. He didn't shout, didn't posture. He simply stepped between Rourke and the boy, his presence an immovable object. "That's enough, Sergeant," Silas said, his voice quiet but carrying an authority that cut through the drunken haze. Rourke, emboldened by alcohol and the presence of his cronies, puffed out his chest. "And who in the hell are you to tell me what's enough, drifter?" He glanced back at Alara, who had risen and taken a few involuntary steps closer, a sneer twisting his lips. "Come to protect your fancy woman." Silas didn't react to the taunt. His eyes, cold as chipped ice, remained fixed on Rourke. "The boy's done nothing. Leave him be." "Or what?" Rourke challenged, taking a menacing step forward. Two of his companions moved to flank him. Silas didn't move, didn't flinch. "Or you'll deal with me." The words were a simple statement of fact, devoid of threat, yet more chilling than any bluster. There was a certainty in him, a readiness that even Rourke, in his drunken state, seemed to recognize. The sergeant's eyes flickered, a moment of doubt warring with his bravado. He looked at Silas's scarred face, the way he stood, balanced and still, and perhaps saw something of the battles Silas had weathered, battles that had left their mark far deeper than just on his skin. Alara held her breath. The tension was a living thing, coiling in the dusty air. She saw Silas's hand, resting near his Colt, not on it, but ready. He was offering a way out, a chance for Rourke to back down without losing too much face. Rourke spat on the ground. "He ain't worth the trouble." He shoved the young private one last time, a less forceful push, then turned and stomped back towards the lean-to, his cronies trailing behind him, grumbling. Silas watched them go, his posture unchanging until they were out of sight. Then, he let out a slow breath and turned to the young private, who was stammering his thanks. Silas just nodded, a brief, almost imperceptible inclination of his head. Then his gaze found Alara. The incident, small as it was in the grand scheme of frontier violence, had shifted something. It wasn't just an offer of a place to stay anymore. It was an offer of protection, demonstrated in action. Silas had drawn a line in the dust, and he had placed her, however implicitly, on his side of it. His intervention, prompted by Rourke's jibe about her, made his protective instinct clear. He had seen the way Rourke looked at her, the casual disrespect, and had acted. He walked back to her, the earlier awkwardness returning, but now overlaid with a new awareness. "Things will only get worse as they pack up," he said, his voice low. "Fewer officers. Discipline gets lax." Alara knew he was right. The outpost was already shedding its thin veneer of order. "Your offer," she began, her voice a little unsteady. "It's a very generous." "It's practical," he corrected, though his eyes, when they met hers, held something more than mere pragmatism. A flicker of concern, perhaps even a hint of the loneliness she recognized in herself. "My ranch. It's a good 2 days' ride. Hard going in parts. But it's secure. Water, some stock. I was heading back anyway." She thought of the scornful woman in the shantytown, of Rourke's sneer, of the long, cold nights ahead with no shelter and a baby on the way. Then she looked at Silas, at the quiet strength in his scarred face, the steadiness in his gaze. He was a risk, an unknown quantity, but staying here or venturing out alone felt like a far greater one. I accept," she said, the words barely a whisper, yet they seemed to echo in the vast silence of the plains. "Thank you, Silas." A small muscle twitched in his jaw. He nodded once, curtly. "We leave at first light. Pack what you need. Travel light." The decision, once made, settled some of the turmoil within her, though a new current of apprehension took its place. She was entrusting her safety, and that of her unborn child, to this quiet, battle-scarred man. He had reaffirmed his choice by stepping in to stop Rourke, not just for the boy, but, she sensed, for her too. She took a small step towards trust, driven by necessity but also by a fragile, burgeoning hope. This first minor conflict, this challenge to their unformed alliance, had been met not by a misunderstanding between them, but by his decisive action, revealing a glimpse of the protector he might prove to be. As she turned to gather her few belongings, the weight of his gaze felt different, no longer just observant, but proprietary, protective. The sparse cabin he described, the difficult land, it was now a destination, a haven, however uncertain. The quiet evenings where unspoken things hung in the air would no longer be hers alone. The journey north was as arduous as Silas had predicted. Alara rode the gentlest of his 2 horses, a sturdy mare named Bess, while Silas walked beside her much of the way, leading the pack mule, his long strides eating up the miles. The sun beat down mercilessly during the day, and the nights were sharp with cold. They spoke little, the landscape itself seeming to impose a kind of silence. But in that shared quiet, a different kind of communication began to form. She learned to read the subtle shifts in his expression, the tightening of his jaw when he sensed unease in the terrain, the slight softening of his eyes when he checked on her comfort. He, in turn, seemed attuned to her unspoken needs, finding sheltered spots for their brief rests, ensuring she had water, sharing his meager rations without comment. One evening, they camped by a small, willow-choked creek. Silas had managed to shoot a pair of sage grouse, and the smell of roasting meat over the small, carefully concealed fire was a welcome change from dried beef and hardtack. Alara watched him as he expertly turned the birds on a makeshift spit, his scarred hands moving with a surprising deftness. "You're good at this," she commented, her voice soft. "Surviving out here." He grunted, a sound that might have been agreement. "Had to learn. Army teaches you some. The rest? You pick up, or you don't last." A shard of his past, offered without embellishment. She wondered about the battles that had scarred him, the life he'd led before he became this solitary rancher. But she didn't ask. She understood the sanctity of unspoken histories. Hers was a burden she carried quietly. She respected his right to do the same. Instead, she found herself telling him a little about her mother, about the herbs and their uses, the way her mother could calm a frightened animal or a crying child with just a touch and a soft word. He listened intently, his gray eyes fixed on her face, and for a moment, the vast, lonely prairie felt a little less empty. These small discoveries, these shared snippets of their former lives, were like tentative bridges built across a chasm of unfamiliarity. He saw her knowledge, her quiet competence in her own sphere, and she began to see beyond his stoic exterior to the thoughtful man beneath. Their arrival at his ranch was anticlimactic. It was less a ranch in the grand sense and more a small, sturdy cabin nestled in a shallow valley, with a decent corral, a small barn, and a patch of land that looked like it might, with considerable effort, support a garden. A creek, wider and more reliable than the one they'd camped by, flowed nearby. It was isolated, starkly beautiful in its own way, the silence broken only by the wind and the distant call of a hawk. The cabin was sparsely furnished but clean. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs, a stone fireplace, a bed built into one corner, and another smaller room off the main one, clearly his own sleeping quarters. He gestured towards the main bed. "You take this." "Silas, I can't take your bed," she protested. "It's bigger. Better for you." He glanced at her belly. A moment of awkwardness before his usual composure returned. "I've got my own room." And so, a new rhythm began. Alara, despite her advancing pregnancy, found ways to contribute. She mended his worn clothes, cooked their meals, simple fare, but she had a knack for making even beans and bacon taste good. She even started a small herb garden near the cabin, using seeds she'd carefully hoarded. Silas worked from sunup to sundown, tending his few head of cattle, repairing fences, chopping wood. He was a man of immense physical strength and quiet endurance. The loneliness of the place was profound, yet it was different from the loneliness she'd felt at the crowded, chaotic outpost. Here, the silence was peaceful, restorative, and she wasn't truly alone. Silas's presence was a constant, reassuring backdrop to her days. They still spoke little, but their shared tasks, their quiet evenings by the fire, wove an invisible thread between them. She'd catch him watching her sometimes, a strange, unreadable expression in his eyes. It wasn't threatening, not like the leers she'd endured before. It was searching, as if he were trying to piece together a puzzle. One afternoon, a lone rider approached the cabin. Alara, who had been sitting outside, enjoying the warmth of the autumn sun, felt a familiar surge of apprehension. Silas was out checking his fences miles away. The rider was a rough-looking man, with shifty eyes and a stained bandana covering the lower half of his face. "Howdy, ma'am," he said, his voice oily. "Just wonderin' if your man's about." "He's not here right now," Alara said, trying to keep her voice steady, her hand instinctively going to her belly. The man's eyes roamed over her, lingering on her pregnant form in a way that made her skin crawl. "Shame. Mighty isolated out here for a pretty little thing like yourself. Especially in your condition," he grinned, revealing yellowed teeth. "A man could get lonely, or a woman could get needful." Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through Alara. This was the kind of threat she'd always dreaded. She stood up slowly. You should go. He'll be back soon. The man chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. Don't see no hurry, he started to dismount. Suddenly, a voice, cold as a winter wind, cut through the air. I think the lady asked you to leave, Silas. He stood at the corner of the barn, his rifle held loosely in his hands, but his stance utterly menacing. He must have circled back, seen the strange horse. Relief washed over Alara, so potent it almost buckled her knees. The shifty-eyed man froze, 1 foot out of the stirrup. He looked from Silas's grim face to the rifle and back again. Just passin' the time of day, friend, he stammered, his bravado evaporating. Time's up, Silas said, his voice flat. Ride out. And don't come back. The man needed no further persuasion. He scrambled back into the saddle and galloped away, not looking back. Silas watched him until he was a speck in the distance, then slowly lowered his rifle. He walked over to Alara, his face set in hard lines. You all right? She nodded, though she was trembling. Yes, thank you, Silas. You came just in time. His jaw tightened. Shouldn't have left you alone. My mistake. He looked out at the empty prairie, a muscle working in his cheek. The incident, this direct threat, seemed to solidify something in him. His protective instincts, already evident, now sharpened, became more pronounced. He began to carry his rifle more often, even when working close to the cabin. He taught her how to load and fire the spare shotgun he kept, his hands briefly, impersonally, covering hers as he showed her the mechanism. The touch, though practical, sent an unexpected tremor through her. The encounter with the drifter deepened the personal stakes for both of them. For Alara, it was a harsh reminder of her vulnerability and a reinforcement of her growing reliance on Silas. For Silas, the fear he'd clearly felt for her safety, the fury that had hardened his eyes, seemed to go beyond mere responsibility. He was developing feelings that transcended the practical arrangement they had. He found himself watching her more, noticing the way a stray curl escaped her braid, the gentle way she hummed as she worked, the quiet courage with which she faced her uncertain future. The thought of losing this fragile piece, this woman who had brought a quiet light into his solitary existence, was becoming unbearable. The first snows of winter began to dust the high peaks, a reminder that time was passing, her confinement drawing nearer. Their quiet companionship had deepened into a fragile kind of intimacy, built on shared hardship and unspoken understanding. She learned about the war that had scarred him not in detail, but in the way he would sometimes fall silent, his eyes distant, a shadow passing over his face when certain sounds or sights triggered a memory. He, in turn, began to see the resilience beneath her gentle exterior, the unwavering strength that had allowed her to survive so much. One evening, as a bitter wind howled outside, they sat by the fire. Alara was mending one of Silas's shirts, her fingers moving nimbly despite their slight swelling. Silas was cleaning his rifle, the metallic clicks and scrapes a familiar sound in the small cabin. The father of your child, he said suddenly, his voice quiet, not looking at her. What happened to him? The question, so direct after months of careful evasion, startled her. She paused in her sewing, her heart thumping. She had dreaded this, yet also, in a strange way, longed for it. The secret was a heavy weight. She took a deep breath. His name was Thomas, she began, her voice trembling slightly. He was a scholar, a good man, gentle. We were heading to Oregon. He took a fever on the trail. It happened so fast her voice broke, and she fought back tears. The memory was still raw, painful. Silas stopped his work, his hands still. He didn't speak, just waited. His silence an invitation rather than a demand. We were married only a short time, she continued, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. He was so excited about the baby. She touched her belly. After he died, I didn't know what to do. The wagon train went on. Couldn't I didn't have the heart for it then. I used what money we had left to get by, ended up near that outpost. Helping the soldiers. It felt like the only thing I could do. Something useful. She finally looked at him. His face was unreadable in the flickering firelight, but his eyes held a profound stillness, a deep, listening quality. I'm sorry, he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't quite decipher. Sorry for your loss, and for what you've been through. His simple words, devoid of pity but full of a quiet empathy, opened something within her. It wasn't the judgment she'd feared, or the curiosity. It was understanding. He must have been a good man, Silas added after a moment. He was, she whispered, a tear finally escaping and tracing a path down her cheek. He would have liked you, I think. You're honorable. The word hung in the air between them. Honorable. It was a quality she had come to associate deeply with Silas. He looked away then, towards the fire, a muscle working in his scarred cheek. The revelation of her past, the truth of her widowhood and her solitude, seemed to change the dynamic between them yet again. It stripped away another layer of her guardedness, and in his quiet acceptance, she felt a profound sense of relief, and a deepening connection to this man who had offered her shelter not just from the elements, but from the harsh judgments of the world. The deep winter settled upon them, isolating the small ranch further. Snowdrifts piled high against the cabin walls, and the wind moaned like a hungry wolf. Inside, however, there was a surprising warmth, not just from the constantly burning fire, but from the quiet companionship that had grown between Alara and Silas. Her time was drawing near, and a new tension, mixed with anticipation, filled the small space. Silas became even more attentive, his gruffness softening into a gentle concern. He made sure she had enough to eat, kept the cabin warm, and often just sat with her in the evenings, sometimes reading aloud from a battered copy of Shakespeare he inexplicably owned, his rough voice surprisingly melodic. Alara found herself looking forward to these moments, to the sound of his voice, the reassuring presence of him nearby. The battle-scarred cowboy was slowly, unintentionally, guarding more than just her physical safety. He was becoming a guardian of her weary heart. One blizzard-swept afternoon, as Alara was kneading dough for bread, a sharp pain shot through her back, making her gasp. She leaned against the table, her breath catching in her throat. Silas, who was repairing a bridle by the fire, was instantly on his feet. Alara, what is it? His voice was sharp with alarm. I think it's time, she whispered, another wave of pain washing over her. Fear, stark and primal, flickered in Silas's eyes, but he quickly masked it. He had faced down armed men without flinching, endured the horrors of war, but this he was clearly unprepared for. Yet, his ingrained pragmatism took over. All right, he said, his voice surprisingly steady. All right, tell me what to do. And so, with the storm raging outside, cutting them off completely from the rest of the world, Alara guided Silas through the ancient, terrifying, and miraculous process of childbirth. He followed her instructions with a desperate focus, his scarred hands, usually so adept with tools and weapons, now surprisingly gentle as he supported her, wiped her brow, and spoke quiet words of encouragement. His earlier fears were subsumed by an overwhelming need to help her, to see her through this. Hours later, as the storm began to abate and a pale dawn filtered through the small window, the cabin was filled with a new sound, the lusty cry of a healthy baby boy. Exhausted but elated, Alara held her son, her heart overflowing. Silas stood by the bed, looking down at the tiny, wrinkled infant with an expression of profound awe and something akin to wonder. The harsh lines on his face seemed to softer, the scars less prominent. He's perfect, Silas murmured, his voice thick with emotion. He reached out a hesitant finger and gently touched the baby's cheek. The infant, as if sensing a kindred spirit, quieted, his tiny hand flailing until it grasped Silas's finger. In that moment, something shifted irrevocably between them. The shared experience, the raw vulnerability, the miracle of new life in the midst of their isolated world, had forged a bond stronger than any spoken words. Silas had not just delivered her child. He had shared in its arrival, had been her rock, her strength. He had seen her at her most vulnerable, and his respect and care had only deepened. "What will you name him?" Silas asked, his gaze still on the baby, then lifting to meet hers. Alara looked at her son, then at Silas. "Thomas," she said softly. "Thomas Samuel. Samuel, for a strong man I know." A slow flush crept up Silas's neck, reaching his scarred cheeks. He looked away, clearly moved, but said nothing. The unspoken declaration hung in the air, a testament to the man he had become in her eyes. This was the game changer, this birth, this shared miracle. The high-pressure countdown of her pregnancy had culminated in this moment of profound connection, revealing not a past trauma, but a future hope, and in Silas's unwavering support, a commitment that went far beyond mere duty. The weeks that followed were a blur of sleepless nights, endless feedings, and the quiet rhythm of caring for a newborn. Silas, to Alara's surprise and quiet joy, was a natural with baby Thomas. He'd hold him for hours, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle, humming tuneless melodies that seemed to soothe the infant. He learned to change swaddling, to rock Thomas to sleep, his usual stoicism melting away in the presence of the child. Alara would watch them, a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. The isolation of the ranch, once a source of slight unease, now felt like a sanctuary. The outside world, with its judgments and dangers, seemed very far away. Here, within the four walls of the small cabin, they had created a fragile haven, a small family unit forged in shared hardship and unexpected tenderness. However, the outside world had a way of intruding. One late spring morning, as the last of the snow melted and the valley began to green, Silas rode out to check on a section of fence damaged by the winter storms. Alara was outside, hanging freshly washed baby clothes on a line, little Thomas asleep in a basket at her feet, when she saw two riders approaching. Her heart lethargia. These weren't familiar figures. They reined in a short distance from the cabin, their expressions hard to read from afar. One was a tall, lean man with a self-important air, wearing a town coat despite the warmth of the day. The other was coarser, bulkier, with a gun belt slung low on his hips, his eyes scanning the cabin and its surroundings with a proprietary air. Alara recognized him with a jolt of fear. It was Sergeant Rourke, the man Silas had faced down at the outpost. "Ma'am," the man in the town coat called out, his voice carrying an unwelcome authority. "We're looking for a Silas Kane. This his place." Alara's mind raced. What did they want with Silas? Rourke's presence boded ill. "He's not here right now," she said, trying to keep her voice even, her hand resting protectively on Thomas's basket. Rourke smirked. "Still hiding behind a woman's skirts, is he?" He swung down from his horse, his companion following suit. "We heard he was shacked up out here with some company." His gaze raked over Alara, lingering on her in a way that made her feel ill. The man in the town coat stepped forward. "My name is Henderson, from Redemption. I'm the new magistrate. It's come to my attention that Mr. Kane is harboring a woman of questionable repute, and that there's a child involved." "Questionable repute?" Alara's voice was sharper now, anger overriding her fear. "I am a widow, sir, and this is my son." Henderson raised an eyebrow. "A widow, you say? With no papers to prove it, I'd wager. Living out here, alone with a man you're not wed to. It's unseemly." The good people of redemption don't hold with such arrangements. What Silas Kane does on his own land, and who he chooses to offer shelter to, is his own business, Alara retorted, standing taller. The months under Silas's quiet protection, the birth of her son, had kindled a strength in her she hadn't known she possessed. Rourke took a step closer, his eyes glinting. We also heard Kane might have come by some army supplies that weren't rightly his. Supplies that went missing around the time that outpost was abandoned. This was it, then. A pretext. Rourke's malice, coupled with Henderson's officious self-righteousness. They were here to cause trouble, to assert their power. The threat was no longer distant. It was on her doorstep. Silas is an honorable man, Alara said firmly. He bought those supplies fairly, for those in need. An honorable man wouldn't be living in sin with a woman and her bastard child, Henderson sneered. We're here to ensure the moral fabric of this county isn't frayed, and to reclaim any stolen property. There's nothing stolen here, Alara insisted, her heart pounding. Where was Silas? As if summoned by her thoughts, Silas's voice cut through the tension, hard and cold as iron. You gentlemen looking for me? He appeared from around the side of the barn, his rifle cradled in his arms, his face a grim mask. He'd clearly seen them arrive and circled around. His eyes, like chips of gray flint, were fixed on Rourke and Henderson. Rourke visibly tensed, his hand dropping to his gun. Henderson looked startled, then puffed himself up. Kane, we've had reports, concerns about your living situation, and accusation, more likely the latter, where you're concerned, Sergeant. Rourke's face darkened. You calling me a liar, Drifter? If the boot fits, Silas replied, his tone even. He took a step forward, placing himself between the men and Alara and the baby. You've got no business here. This is private land. Henderson stepped forward, brandishing a piece of paper. I have a warrant, Kane, to search these premises for stolen goods and to investigate the welfare of the child. There are folks in Redemption willing to offer the boy a more suitable upbringing. Alara gasped. Take Thomas? The threat was a knife to her heart. She moved to stand beside Silas, her fear now eclipsed by a fierce maternal rage. You will not take my son. Silas's arm shot out, not to restrain her, but to steady her, a brief, reassuring pressure. Nobody is taking the boy, he said, his voice a low growl. And nobody is searching my home without a damn good reason, which you don't have. That warrant ain't worth the paper it's printed on out here, Henderson, and you know it. The standoff was complete. The air crackled with unspoken violence. It was 2 against 2, but Silas's quiet lethality seemed to outweigh Rourke's bluster and Henderson's assumed authority. This was the showdown, the culmination of simmering resentments and societal judgment. Silas was making his stand, not just for his property, but for Alara, for Thomas, for the life they had begun to build. Henderson hesitated. He was a man of paper and pronouncements, not bullets. Rourke, however, seemed to relish the confrontation. His eyes were narrowed, fixed on Silas. You always did think you were better than everyone else, Kane. Even back in the war. Always so high and mighty. So there was history there. A deeper animosity. I just tried to do what was right. Rourke, Silas said, his voice tight. Something you wouldn't understand. Right? Rourke spat. Taking up with another man's leavings? That what you call right? Before Silas could react to the vile insult, Alara stepped forward, her eyes blazing. How dare you? She cried, her voice ringing with a strength that surprised them all, even Silas. You know nothing of me or of him. Silas Kane is a better man than you will ever be. He's a man of honor, of courage, of kindness. He saved my life and my son's life. He gave us shelter when no one else would. This is our home. And you are not welcome here. Her words, so passionate, so fierce, hung in the air. Rourke looked momentarily taken aback by her vehemence. Henderson shifted uncomfortably. Even Silas looked at her with a kind of stunned admiration. She had found her voice, and it was powerful. Silas's expression softened almost imperceptibly as he looked at Alara, then hardened again as he faced their antagonists. "You heard the lady," he said, his voice resonating with a new depth of conviction. "This is our home," he emphasized the word, our, a public declaration of their unity. "Now, I suggest you both mount up and ride out before you regret trespassing." Rourke's hand twitched towards his gun. "I don't take orders from you, Kane." "That ain't an order, Rourke," Silas said, his rifle shifting slightly, the movement almost too quick to see. "It's a statement of fact. You draw on me in front of this woman and child, and Henderson here will be witness to justifiable homicide. And you'll be dead." The raw, unvarnished truth of his words seemed to finally penetrate Rourke's bravado. He looked at Silas's eyes, saw the unwavering resolve there, the scars that spoke of a man who knew death intimately and did not fear it. He saw Alara, standing defiant and proud beside him. He saw the baby, a symbol of the life they were defending. Henderson, clearly unnerved by the turn of events, tugged at Rourke's sleeve. "Sergeant, perhaps we've been hasty. We can discuss this further in redemption." Rourke glared at Silas one last time, his face contorted with impotent rage. But the fight had gone out of him. He knew he was outmatched not just in firepower but in moral certainty. He turned abruptly and stomped towards his horse. Henderson, visibly relieved, scurried after him. They mounted, and without another word, rode away, their departure far less imposing than their arrival. Silas and Alara watched them go, standing side by side, until they were out of sight. The silence that descended was profound, broken only by the gentle cooing of baby Thomas, oblivious to the drama that had just unfolded. Alara let out a shaky breath, the adrenaline slowly ebbing, leaving her feeling weak but strangely exhilarated. She had faced down her fear, spoken her truth. Silas slowly lowered his rifle, then turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "You all right?" he asked, his voice still rough, but the harshness gone. She nodded, a watery smile touching her lips. "Yes, thanks to you. And perhaps a little thanks to me, too." A rare smile touched his own lips, transforming his scarred face, making him look younger, almost boyish. "More than a little, Alara. You were magnificent." He reached out, his calloused hand gently cupping her cheek. The gesture was tender, possessive, a silent acknowledgement of everything that had passed between them, everything they had become to each other. In that moment, standing before their small cabin, with the vast Wyoming sky above them and their son safe in his basket, the threat was neutralized. The antagonists had been rebuffed, shamed not by violence, but by their unified stand, by Alara's fierce defense of their life together, and by Silas's unwavering commitment. The sacrifice had been their solitude, their individual pasts, traded for a shared future. Their bond, forged in hardship and tempered by love, was now unbreakable, recognized and declared. They had chosen each other, chosen this life, and in doing so, had found their own kind of redemption, not in a town, but in the sanctuary of their shared hearts. The immediate aftermath of the confrontation was a profound quietude, a settling of dust both literal and emotional. Alara leaned against Silas, drawing strength from his solid presence, the scent of pine and leather and him a comforting balm. He kept his arm around her, a protective, possessive embrace that spoke volumes. Baby Thomas gurgled happily in his basket, blissfully unaware of the danger that had brushed so close. The sun, climbing higher, bathed the small valley in a warm, golden light, making the fresh green of spring seem even more vibrant. It felt like the world had been holding its breath and had finally, deeply exhaled. Silas eventually broke the silence, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. They won't be back soon. It wasn't a question, but a certainty. Henderson was a creature of bureaucracy, not bravery, and Rourke, for all his bluster, had seen a truth in Silas's eyes he wouldn't easily forget. He'd also seen Alara's strength, a force perhaps even more formidable. No, Alara agreed, a sense of peace settling over her. I don't think they will. The fear that had been her constant companion for so long was receding, replaced by a quiet confidence. She had found her voice, her agency, standing beside Silas, defending not just her son, but their life together. She was no longer just the pregnant woman nursing soldiers, nor the vulnerable widow. She was Alara Kane, in spirit if not yet by formal vow, a woman who had faced down prejudice and malice and found her strength. A few days later, a rider did approach, but this time it was old Jedediah Smith, a grizzled trapper who lived a few valleys over, a man Silas traded with occasionally. Jedediah had heard tell in redemption of Henderson's blustering about the situation at Kane's ranch. He'd also heard the considerably more subdued, and somewhat odd, whispers about how Kane and his woman had sent the magistrate and Rourke packing with their tails between their legs. Heard you folks had a bit of a discussion with that windbag Henderson, Jedediah said, a twinkle in his eye as he accepted a cup of coffee from Alara. Some folks in town are saying Henderson looked like he'd seen a ghost. And Rourke, well, he ain't been so loudmouthed since he took a sip of coffee. Good for you. Some of us think Henderson needs talking down a peg or two. And that woman of his puts on airs something fierce. It was a small thing, this shift in local gossip, but it hinted at a grudging respect, a recognition that Silas and Alara were not to be trifled with. Their stand had, perhaps, altered perceptions, even if only for a few. It wasn't systemic change, but it was a crack in the wall of prejudice. Life settled into a new rhythm, one imbued with a deeper sense of security and shared purpose. The ranch, once just Silas's solitary holding, now felt like a true home to Alara. The herb garden flourished under her care. The cabin, small as it was, seemed to expand with the warmth of their growing affection. Silas began to talk more, sharing stories of his youth before the war, tales of a mischievous boy rather than a battle-hardened soldier. He listened, truly listened, when Alara spoke of Thomas, her first husband, not with jealousy, but with a quiet respect for the love she had borne him. This understanding, this acceptance of each other's pasts, was part of their ongoing healing. The tasks of daily life became shared rituals. Mending fences together, Silas patiently showing her how to stretch the wire just so. Planting a small vegetable patch, their hands brushing as they worked the soil. Evenings spent with Thomas gurgling between them as Silas read, or Alara sang soft lullabies. These simple moments were imbued with a profound meaning, a testament to the life they were building on a foundation of courage, compassion, and a love that had taken root in the unlikeliest of circumstances. One evening, as a soft summer twilight painted the sky in hues of lavender and rose, Alara sat on the small porch Silas had added to the cabin, nursing Thomas. Silas sat beside her, whittling a small wooden bird for the baby, his scarred hands surprisingly deft. The air was filled with the scent of wildflowers and the gentle hum of insects. He paused in his whittling, looking out at the valley, peaceful and serene in the fading light. Never thought, he began, then hesitated, a rare show of vulnerability. Never thought I'd have this again. A home. Someone to share it with. Alara leaned her head against his shoulder. Me neither, Silas. She looked down at their son, his small face peaceful as he nursed. He's a lucky boy, to have you. Silas put down his whittling and gently took her free hand, his thumb stroking the back of it. We're lucky, Alara. All three of us. He turned his head, his gray eyes, now so familiar and dear to her, meeting hers. They were clear, no longer guarded, reflecting the deep affection and contentment he felt. You nursed soldiers, brought comfort to dying men. You saved lives. And then you came here and saved mine, in ways you probably don't even realize. She smiled, her heart full. And you, Silas Kane, you guarded my heart until it felt safe enough to beat properly again. He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that sealed all the unspoken promises, all the shared trials, all the quiet joys. It was a kiss that spoke of home, of belonging, of a future forged together against the odds. He looked at her, truly saw her, not as the pregnant woman in distress he'd first encountered, but as his partner, his strength, the mother of his son in all but blood, and the woman who held his battle-scarred heart in her gentle hands. And as the stars began to prick the darkening sky over their small, peaceful valley, Silas knew he had found more than just a companion. He had found his peace, his purpose, his love. He had guarded her heart, and in doing so had found his own. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.